Hello, students. It's kind of chilly today. It's Sunday, the 20th. And today hopefully I'm going to cover modules 5 and 6. Now, these are I understand how self-learning in these chapters can be very difficult because it is very technical. Okay, so the chapter begins with the tools of discovery, that we have today. And we've talked about these briefly in previous lectures. Okay, so an EEG, that's electrical. You've got an MRI, a functional MRI. I'm not going to go over all of those. I want you to be aware of them, certainly for your launch pad. But that's not something that I'm going to cover on your first exam. Okay. And then you have a CT scan, a PET scan. Probably some of you have had some of these things. Okay. All right. So what I want to start with is the structures of the brain. Okay. Now the brain is really in two segments, if you can think of it that way. You've got the older part of the brain, which is covered in this chapter, and then you've got the cerebral cortex, which includes the 4 lobes and the 2 hemispheres in the next chapter. Okay. So let's start with the oldest parts of the brain. Okay, the brainstem itself. So right up top of the spinal cord, sorry, I dropped my pen. Right at top of the spinal cord is what's called the medulla. It looks like a swelling at the top of the spinal cord. And the medulla is responsible for things like heart rate, breathing. An individual can be in a coma and not have to be on life support. Remember, we talked about Terry Schiavo when we did case studies. Okay, as long as the medulla is functioning and is intact, then that will take over your breathing and your life support. Okay, so that's an important part of the brain. Okay, right at top of that, you have the pons. And your author doesn't talk a lot about the pons, but it does have to do with some learning. It has to do with things along those lines. And again, your book doesn't really spend a lot of time talking about it, so I'm not going to either. Okay, and then you've got the reticular formation. Okay, and the reticular formation it starts in the lower part of the brain, and it does intertwine up into some of the upper regions of the brain, not the cerebral cortex, but it has to do with arousal, okay? Being awake, being asleep. So if they cut the reticular formation I believe they did it in a cat, or it might have been a rat, it fell into a coma that it never recovered from. Okay, so it has to do with attention, being awake, being asleep, being in a coma. Okay. The next one is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is right at the back of your brain, okay, right at the very back. And there's nice little diagrams in your book. They call it, some neuroscientists call it the little brain, because it does kind of look like a little brain itself at the very back. This is responsible for coordination. This is very important, actually. Coordination. Okay, and he talks about David Beckham, the soccer player, and how he's got a finely tuned cerebellum because he can dart across a soccer field and anticipate moves and all of that. If you look at basketball players, if you look at divers, individuals who do high diving, they have incredible cerebellums. Okay. Someone who has damage to their cerebellum, they have an uneven gait. So one of my mentally challenged individuals that I took care of, he was in his 80s. He fell out of a second-story window when he was 2. And you could still see the damage to his cerebellum that was a result of that fall, because he walked like he was going to fall down. He tottered like a toddler would. He never did. He rarely fell down, but it was just really uneven gait. Okay, the next one is the thalamus. And if my board was bigger, I could expand all this. But the thalamus is a very small structure of the brain, and it's a system of the forebrain, but we call it the switching station. Okay, so what the thalamus does is it takes input. Okay, we talked about the peripheral nervous system last time. It takes the input from your extremities and all of your senses, with the exception of smell, sight, all of your senses, taste, hearing, and it routes it to the part of the brain that can interpret it. Okay, and it also sends some messages through from the brain to the lower extremities, but it's mostly a switching station for incoming sensory. Okay, so that's the thalamus. And the way I remembered this when I was a young psych student was the S on the end. Thalamus, switching station. Okay, and then we have the limbic system. And the limbic system is very important, and it has functions that help us to survive. Okay, so as soon as I find my eraser. Here we go. Okay, so the limbic system is really very extensive. Your book doesn't cover much of the limbic system. There are a lot of different structures of the limbic system that your book doesn't actually cover. Okay, so this is a separate aspect in your book. Okay, your book spends some time on it. I don't know why my eraser isn't working very well today. Okay, so first of all, remember when we talked about the pituitary gland? And I think I briefly mentioned the hypothalamus. Okay, I think I need a new eraser. Okay, so the hypothalamus is next door to the pituitary gland. And remember, we said that the pituitary gland is the master gland. Okay, so first of all, your book includes the hippocampus. And one of the main functions of the limbic system has to do with memory and emotion. And if you think about that, memory and emotion are very intertwined, aren't they? Memories can evoke extremely intense emotions, and emotions can evoke memories, very vivid memories. And the reason for that is because they're part of the limbic system. Okay, so the hippocampus is memory. And when we get to that chapter, we'll study it in greater depth. But the hippocampus has to do with laying down new memories. So individuals with damage to the hippocampus very often have short-term memory loss. They can't lay down new memories. Okay, the next structure of the limbic system that your book talks about is the amygdala. And the amygdala has to do with emotions. Limbic system. Okay, so emotions. And the extremes of emotions. So you have aggression, rage, and fear. Okay, so the way that I remembered this as a budding psych student was I had a roommate named Amy. And boy, she was all over the board with all these emotions. And so that's how I remember that. Okay, so the amygdala is another very important part of the limbic system. And there were a lot of experiments done with the amygdala. Sticking an electrode in one part of the amygdala of a cat will make it stand up like it's going to fight. It'll bare its teeth and its claws. If you stimulate another area of the amygdala, it will cower in the corner if you introduce it to a mouse. Okay, so those are the two extremes of the amygdala. Okay, your book does include a few other things. It includes the hypothalamus in the limbic system, which it is very closely related. Hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is a very interesting brain structure. And the way that this was discovered, what the hypothalamus is involved with, was actually in 1954, two McGill University neurophysiologists were trying to put an electrode into the reticular formation of, I believe it was a cat. And was it a cat? No, it was a rat. It was a rat, I'm sorry. So anyway, so they missed and they hit the hypothalamus. And what they discovered was that the rat kept returning to the place, the physical place where it got the stimulation from the electrode. And so they looked into this and they thought, well, let's do some further experiments here. So they set up experiments where the rat could push a lever and give himself the electrical charge in his hypothalamus. So they did further experiments. They let him hit the lever as many times as he wanted, and that rat dropped of exhaustion pushing the lever. Did it for about an hour and then dropped of exhaustion. So what was this rat experiencing? And I know where your head's going to go with this. And I thought about this for a while, because in human beings, we call the hypothalamus the pleasure center, because it has a lot to do with things like when you're hungry, eating, things that are very pleasurable to us, obviously sex, drinking water when you're thirsty. So it is adaptive. It helps us to survive. Okay, in the rat and other species, we call it the reward center, because we really don't want to attribute, human emotions specifically to other species when, we're not clear exactly. So the example that I finally came up with for my psych students was, okay, let's just say you go to the casino, which is reopened, and you sit in front of a slot machine. And I understand now that slot machines don't work the way they used to. But if you sat in front of what they used to call a one-armed bandit, where you put in the quarter or the money or the token, and then you pull the lever, and it rings up. What if every time you pulled that lever, you got $100 bill? If you sat there, wouldn't you keep pulling that lever until you dropped of exhaustion? I know I would. It'd be like, that's my next year's tax bill, and this is my kid's next tuition payment. And, that's the best example I could come up with. Okay, so further experiments, they set up an electrical grid, and they put food on the other side of it. And the rat wouldn't cross it to get the food. However, when they put the lever on the other side of the grid, the rat would cross it. If they made available to him an electrical stimulation in his hypothalamus, he'd cross the electric grid. Okay, so that was kind of interesting, actually. Okay, so those are the basics for this very first module that we're covering today, Chapter 5. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. So that's a real quick overview of what's in that particular chapter. I covered basically everything that's in there that I want you to be aware of. However, there's a lot more in there that you'll probably bump into when you do the launch pad. But as in terms of my exam, I won't ask you about anything other than those. Okay, so we're going to start with Chapter 6, or Module 6 now. Okay, remember what we talked about, how many billions and billions of neurons there are, and how you have like trillions of neural connections, and that's certainly true in your brain. Okay, so the part of the brain that psychologists are largely interested in is the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is when you open up a brain, it's almost, Halloween's on the offing, and, you see a lot of brains. But anyway, when you open up a human brain or a primate or any brain, actually, you see all that wrinkly stuff on the top of it. Okay, so this is actually the first class that I've been able to use my brain that you can see it, because it's pretty small. Okay, so anyway, so the very overlay, when you open up a skull, this is what you see. You see this gray area here. And it looks like It's got wrinkles in it, basically. That's what it looks like. And if I turn this sideways, you can see the cerebellum. See in the very back of the brain. This is the back of the brain, the hindbrain. And you can see what is referred to as the two little brains. So that's the cerebral cortex. That's the covering or the outside of the older parts of the brain. And if you actually took this out and stretched it out, it would be about the size of a large pizza. But the wrinkles enable it to fit into our skulls without us looking like aliens. And that's how that all works. Okay, now, I just want to point out the inside here. And I know you can't see that particularly well. But these are the structures of the older part of the brain. Okay, so you have the pituitary gland, the medulla, the pons. It's all right there. And then you have the hypothalamus and the thalamus. Okay, so the outer layer here are the four lobes. And you've probably been exposed to that before. Okay, now, one thing I want to point out between the two hemispheres, you've got a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and I'm sure you're aware of that as well. There's a communication system called the corpus callosum. That is actually the axons that connect the left brain to the right brain so it can communicate with each other. And this is a very important aspect of our brain so that the left part hemisphere of your brain can communicate with the right side. Now, it was believed that the left hemisphere was dominant and the right hemisphere was, just along for the ride. But we know now that that's not true. Okay, and that there are certain things that the left part of the brain or the left hemisphere does better or is more dominant than the right, but it's true of the right as well. Okay, so the cerebral cortex. Now, remember we talked about glial cells last week. And glial cells, we used to call them the nanny cells, but they act in the brain as communicators, or that's what neuroscientists have discovered. And there's 9 times as many glial cells as there are neurons. Okay, so again, I'm sure you're aware of this, but you have 4 lobes, left and right. So 4 lobes. I thought that would work better or erase better, but I guess it won't. Okay, so first of all, each one of those lobes actually has structures in it that carries out specific functions of the brain. Okay, so first of all, let's start with the frontal lobe. Okay, and I'm not an artist, but I will do my best. Okay, so let's just say that this is the back of the brain, and this is the cerebral cortex, but this is the back, and this is the front. So in the front, you have 2 frontal lobes. And these are very important. These are what enables us to think and plan and understand and be rational and have judgment. In teenagers, the frontal lobes are not fully developed. They're not fully developed until you're in your basically your mid-20s. This is why a lot of teenagers suffer from impulsivity, because their judgment isn't quite there yet. It's not just experience. It has a lot to do with the development of the frontal lobes. Okay, so I'm going to do all of these, and then I'm going to look at the different areas. Okay, right behind that, you have the parietal lobes. Okay, and then right here, and like I said, I'm sorry for my artwork. Okay, you have temporal lobes. Okay, and that's easy to remember. It's right at your temple. Okay, all right, so you have the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes, the temporal lobes, and I'm going to talk about the different areas in these lobes that have functions. Okay, and then the final one is the occipital lobes. Occipital lobes. Okay, and this is where your area for sight is. Okay, you know that old saying, your mother has eyes in the back of your head? Well, it's kind of true, because the area for vision is in the occipital lobe. Okay, All right, but let's start with the frontal lobes because they have a very important ribbon. Right at the very back of the frontal lobes is your motor cortex. Now, if you remember what I said last week, all of the signals from your brain to your extremities and from your extremities to your brain is a one-way street. Okay, so the motor cortex sends information, sends your desire to walk, okay, down through the thalamus, through your spinal cord, etc., and you move your hands. Okay, so the motor cortex has to do with your voluntary motions. It's very important. Okay, now right at the beginning of the parietal, or in front of the parietal lobes, and this didn't come out very well, is what we call the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so the somatosensory cortex receives information from your senses, from your extremities, from your ears, from your vision, all of that. And it's all rooted through the thalamus to the part of the brain that can interpret it. Okay, so when you see that information goes through the thalamus and is rooted to the part of the occipital lobe that can interpret it. Okay. All right. Now, there's a couple of other really important areas of the brain that are within these lobes. However, your book, he moved them. You have speech and understanding language that are two separate. Speech is Broca's area. It's right in your left lobe, frontal lobe. And Wernicke's area, which has to do with understanding, is in your temporal lobes. But I'm not going to ask you to remember that because he moved it to a different chapter. If we were in class, I would. Okay. All right. So you also have auditory areas in the temporal lobe, and that makes sense. It's right by your ear. So everything is exchanged. Okay. So the information from your left ear goes through the hypothalamus and is interpreted in the opposite hemisphere. Okay. And as I said, you're probably aware of that all the information that comes from your motor cortex crosses over to your right side. Okay. And that's an interesting thing. Now, back to the corpus callosum for a second. So the corpus callosum is the communication system between the two hemispheres. Now, there have been cases in severe seizures where the corpus callosum has actually been cut so that the two hemispheres can't communicate with each other. So if a seizure starts in one hemisphere, it doesn't just all of a sudden just be transported to the right hemisphere. So in the case of severe seizures, sometimes that can't be controlled any other way, drugs, etc., then they will cut the corpus callosum. And what's interesting about these individuals is that you wouldn't even know that they had one, that their corpus callosum was cut. They generally function very well. Sometimes the hemispheres don't agree. But I did have a student once who said her younger brother had his corpus callosum cut and that you really couldn't tell unless you trick them. And that comes later on in the chapter. Okay, so you have visual cortexes, you have auditory cortexes, you've got the motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex, and all of those are very important. Okay. All right. So I want to give you one quick example of how the left and right hemispheres have differences. Okay. So I'm left-handed. So that means that the information from the left part of my body is interpreted in the right hemisphere, okay, with the exception of speech. So the right hemisphere is pretty good at spatial relations. If you look into history, you'll find that a lot of very famous and renowned artists were left-handed. Okay, so I'm a pilot, and 10% of the population is left-handed. That's a good fact to remember. So 10% of the population is left-handed. And when we look at cave drawings, et cetera, this has been stable right through our history, the percent of people that are left-handed. So spatial relations is done, I don't want to say better, but there's a dominance of spatial relations that are interpreted in your right hemisphere. 40% of pilots are left-handed. So that's really skewed from the general population. Does that mean that left-handed pilots are better pilots than right-handed? No. But what I do believe, or what my hypothesis is that to a left-handed person who's beginning flying lessons, it comes easier to them. Because flying is all about spatial relations. And it's not just, okay, how high above the ground am I when I flare? It's about where is my little airplane in relation to north, south, east, and west? Where's the airport, et cetera? So I think that it's quite possible that left-handed people are better at that in the beginning. Okay, it comes a little more natural to them than to a right-handed person, so they stick with it. So a person who's right-handed who might have a little more problems with the spatial relations, they might not complete their training, okay? I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but anyway, okay. All right, so, so another part of the brain that's very important are called association areas, okay? So association areas are where if you put an electrode into this part of the brain, or the cerebral cortex, you're not going to get a knee-jerk response. Okay. All right. So there's a nice little diagram in your book that shows about the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. Okay. So I want to talk about that for a minute, and then I'll continue. It's a great little diagram in Chapter 6. So take a look at that. I really, over the years when I've been teaching this, it really surprises me how that's such a great diagram. And it really brings home how specific the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex are. Okay. All right. So let's start with the motor cortex. Okay. So the motor cortex at the very back of your frontal lobes has specific areas that are designated for specific parts of the body. Okay. Now, what the diagram shows you is that some areas of the body have more real estate on the motor cortex than others do. Okay. And if you look at it, okay, the real estate that's assigned to a specific area. Okay, so for example, one of the reasons why we have speech is because of so many muscles in your face, okay, particularly around your mouth. So that part of your face has a lot of real estate on the motor cortex. And how this diagram shows you is that it shows your face as being very large. Your lips have an enormous amount of real estate. And if you think about that, your lips are, that's part of your speech as well. Okay, your thumb has a lot of real estate. And that's what makes us different, than a lot of other species, is that opposing thumb. Things like your knee, not so much. Now, if you need knee surgery, you probably wouldn't agree with, okay, so now I can't walk at all because of my knee. But if you look at that, you'll see how this is. So this was mapped by Penfield and his associate way back. I mean, this was done years and years and years ago. I believe it was at the end of the 19th century. So in the 1800s, you had this mapped. Okay, all right. So the same thing goes for the somatosensory cortex, which is right next door at the front of the parietal lobe. So again, things like your face, your lips, your thumb, they have more real estate on them in terms of the senses, what you feel from that. Your lips are very sensitive, which is why kissing is popular. Okay. And also your hands, okay, they have your thumb in particular, but your fingers, they're very sensitive, okay, to touch. So you can find things in the dark and that sort of thing. Okay. All right. So that's important. That's an important aspect of these two as well. Okay. Now I want to talk about brain plasticity. So brain plasticity is the ability of the brain to regenerate or to reorganize after injury. Okay, so plasticity. And it's most pronounced in young children. Okay, so a young child's brain can reorganize pretty quickly and pretty well when there's brain damage. Now, that doesn't mean that all children with brain damage recover 100%. That's not so. It's the same thing in an adult. If you've known anyone who's had a stroke, some individuals who have had strokes recover pretty well with physical therapy, others not so well, or maybe part of their body recovers pretty well and the another part doesn't. Okay, so brain plasticity is the ability of the brain to reorganize after damage. Now, in your book, you're going to see that there was a young girl, and this is true, there's been several of them done. In the event that the seizures, really violent seizures, sometimes one of the hemispheres will begin to disintegrate, and eventually that would kill the individual. So they actually have done hemispherectomies where they remove one complete hemisphere. Now, generally, children under the age of 5, or right around the age of 5, they do pretty well. And if you look at the picture in your book of the little girl who had the hemispherectomy, she's functioning pretty well. She's doing ballet. Okay, so under 5. After that, it doesn't mean necessarily that the individual's intellect will be severely impaired, but they may never regain control or function of the associated side of the body. And this is true of stroke victims as well. Okay, so a hemispherectomy is a good example of brain plasticity, particularly in young children. One of the first ones that was ever done, and there was a film made about it. Anyway, they took out this young girl, and I think she was 3, so she was a good candidate. They took out her complete left hemisphere. Now, if you remember what I said about Broca's area for language and vernacular, it's only in the left hemisphere. It's one of the few things, it's not redundant in your right hemisphere. So the doctor, the surgeon, said to the parents, I don't know if your little girl's ever going to be able to talk again because we're removing the part of her brain that is responsible for speech. So the little girl recovered from surgery, and when she opened her eyes, she said, Mom, that's pretty amazing. There was an experiment done with an adult, and they probably did more of these, but I'm just going to explain it to you because I usually use this in class. So there was an experiment done with a college student, and she was blindfolded. Okay. What they discovered was that this individual, he was a man who was blind and did Braille. When they gave him a functional MRI, or they looked at his brain functioning, what they recognized was that the visual cortex in the occipital lobe was lighting up when he was reading Braille. It wasn't just the somatosensory, it was his actual visual cortex was lighting up. So they began to wonder, well, so the brain can reorganize in that if there's an area that's not being used because of damage or whatever to that, what's assigned to it, it may actually reorganize to be more useful for something that is important in that individual's life. So reading Braille was important to him. So his fingertips was the sensory from that was processed in his vision center. Okay, so what they did was they blindfolded this young girl for 6 days, maybe it was 5 days, and they took a functional MRI of her brain, rubbing something on her index finger. and it lit up where they expected in her somatosensory cortex. Okay, they blindfolded her for 5 days, and they taught her how to read Braille, so she read a lot of Braille. After the 5 days, they retested her, and her visual cortex lit up just like the man who was actually blind. That's how quick the brain can reorganize. And that was astounding stuff. Okay, all right, so brain plasticity was very important as well. Okay. All right, so I talked a little bit about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And I do want to talk a little bit about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere and cutting the corpus callosum and the experiments that we've done as a result of that. Okay, so let's think about this for a minute. If I blindfolded you and you had to cut corpus callosum, if I put a pen in your left hand, could you tell me what was in it? Okay. Now, in a normal person, they could. I mean, they could feel it or whatever. Now, in a person who has their corpus callosum cut, if you put a pen in their left hand, let's follow this through, that information goes through the thalamus to the right side of the brain, okay? The right side, the somatosensory area in the right side of the brain. So the right hemisphere knows what's in its hand, but it can't tell the left hemisphere. And Broca's area for speech is only in the left hemisphere. So that person can't tell you what's in their hand. Okay, so that's one way of tricking an individual with a cut corpus callosum, in that you can understand that that is one difference. Okay, all right, so there are hemispheric differences, and your book lists some of them. I just wanted you to be aware of that more than anything else. Okay, all right, you also have master stem cells in the fetal brain that can migrate and develop into any kind of neuron or in any area of the brain and adapt or be functional in that area of the brain. So it can develop into any type of brain cell. And we know about stem cell research and how important that has become. Okay, but we used to think that in adults, that's not true. That the brain material that you have, you're gonna, once you start to get older, you lose a lot of the function. You have tiny little cells deep in your brain that migrate all throughout your lifetime. Okay, and some people age better than others, obviously, but that's what we know now about the adult brain, is that it does regenerate. In other words, it does have new cells that grow and function in those parts of the brain. Okay. So that's pretty much what I wanted you to know here. I know this is an enormous amount of material. Okay, so I started talking about association areas. Okay, so association areas is where you give an electrical stimulation to a part of the cerebral cortex and you don't get that knee-jerk response. If you stimulate a part of the motor cortex, you're going to get a knee-jerk reaction. Your thumb will move, your finger will move. This is like interneurons, okay, where that reflex. So when you stimulate part of the motor cortex, you get some sort of a knee-jerk reaction. So individuals used to think that association areas, as they're called, didn't do anything. Okay, maybe you've heard this. It's a hard weed to get out of the garden, that we only use 10% of our brains. Well, that's not true. But the association areas are about 3/4 of brain mass, okay, in your cerebral cortex. So they're about 3/4 of the cerebral cortex that contain these neurons. What this association areas does is it integrates all this information. So its associations areas are very important. They also integrate information with memories that are stored. Okay, and these kinds of topics we'll pick up in another chapter. But I wanted you to be aware of that. Okay. One more thing that your book talks about, and maybe you've heard of him as well, that I do want to cover briefly, is Phineas Gage. Okay. So Phineas Gage, and if you look at the picture of his skull in your book, or Google him, watch something on him. Okay, so Phineas Gage was a railroad worker. Um, and he worked with explosives. He was actually a foreman. In 1848, he was 25 years old. And he was working with explosives, and it went off. And a steel rod went right up through his chin and through his frontal lobes. And it was more his left frontal lobe. If you look, you can see it's more skewed toward his left frontal lobe. Okay, so he got up. They quickly rushed to him to help him, and they dragged him to a doctor who stitched him up, and he survived, which was pretty amazing. But what happened to Phineas Gage, who was one of the most famous case studies, is his personality changed. Okay, so he used to be very congenial. He could be a foreman. People liked him. He was articulate. After the accident, he became aggressive. He was grumpy. He wasn't as articulate, and people didn't want to be around him. He could no longer be a foreman because this affected his frontal lobes to the extent that his planning and his judgment wasn't what it had been. But his personality changed, and he did live, I believe he lived for 10 years after the accident, but he died in a nursing home because no one wanted to be around him. Anyway, he's one of the most famous case studies that we know of. Okay, so anyway, this is one of the things that we look at now, is that your left frontal lobe processes more of your positive feelings. Okay. Whereas the right frontal lobe processes more. Do I have that right? Let's see. Hang on a second. Yes. Okay. And the right processes more of the negative. Okay. So in Phineas Gage's example, because the left lobe, frontal lobe, was so damaged, he was left with more of the negative, okay, which contributed to his personality change. Okay, so read about him. He's really interesting. And like I said, maybe you've heard about him before. Okay, all right. Oh, I know what the name of that film was, about the young girl who had the hemispherectomy. It was called Gifted Hands. So if you have the chance, you can take a look at that. The other thing is that when I do this in class, I use a really old film, a piece of a little old film called Regarding Henry. And it was Harrison Ford, and he was shot. And he, in his right frontal lobe, his personality changed, but he also had suffered from anoxia. But if you're interested, check it out. Okay. All right. Hopefully this is helpful. I know that there are at least 4 of you out there watching these because you've given me some feedback on them. So I'll continue to do them, and hopefully they'll be helpful. Okay. Have a good rest of your weekend.